What I want to do is just begin by, well, first let me just say, like I often tell my students on the very first day of class, again, this is leadership and social ethics, so in case you want to be somewhere else, feel free. As I pray just in a moment, when we bow our heads and close our eyes, you can tip out. You don't even have to lift up the finger, right? You can just kind of tip out, right? And we won't talk about you until after you get around the corner here. But so hopefully we'll have some time together. I want this to be somewhat kind of interactive and engaging. That's one of the benefits of doing a workshop as opposed to kind of a larger plenary session, so that we can kind of engage and think together about some of these issues that I think are important, and I think you'll find important as well. I want to think about it primarily theologically, like theological categories, and how our theological categories can kind of shape, inform our imagination. Right? One of the things I think we really need to do and work on is having a kind of an expanded moral imagination, right? Imagining what life can be like together. How do we do life in this kind of a Hoffer sense, doing life together? Maybe we should have an expanded moral imagination of what that can look like in light of the world in which we live. Father, we do give thanks on this morning. We thank you for the life that we have in your Son, Jesus Christ. We thank you for our union with Christ and being seated, lifted up in the heavenly realms, God, and we know that Jesus is interceding for us, Lord, and we know that we have an audience with you because of Jesus. And so we thank you that you hear this prayer. We pray that you bless our time on this morning. We pray that our conversation, discussion be fruitful, give us insight on things that are close to your heart. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable and pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my rock. All right, amen. That's one I think may pull that door up a little bit, just to I think those who probably won't make their way here have done so already. All right, so basic objectives today is just kind of think a little bit about this idea of leadership and social ethics, right? So what I wanted to spend more time is thinking about a theological framework for social ethics, and then kind of ending with, well, what are the kinds of qualities and characteristics and maybe the ways we should think about preparation with regard to leadership with respect to social ethics. And one of the reasons why I think a theological framework is so important is oftentimes because in certain communities we have thought about ethics merely in kind of the personal and interpersonal dimension. Sometimes not only just the interpersonal, but a lot of times just intrapersonal in some respects. But the reality is that ethics is about how we bump into each other, how we do life together. And so there is a larger social dimension that comes with these particular conversations. And so the way I like to begin this is just to reflect a little bit on a theology of creation, right? A theology of creation. What does a theology of creation, kind of look like, right? This is God's world, right? God created. We see this open up in the beginning of the Genesis account here. And there are three fundamental things I want to just kind of suggest for us that flow out of this theology of creation, right? So when you read that Genesis chapter 1, you see every aspect of creation, God's world, it said it is good, right? This Hebrew word tov, and I have a Hebrew scholar in my midst, right? So I'm going to look and see if he nods, if he agrees, right? That I know I'm in good standing. If not, I say, oh, well, maybe I have to go back and check my sources, right? This whole idea of tov, good, right? This idea of tov is not necessarily a kind of a moral goodness, at least as it's understood in Genesis 1, right? Because it's kind of odd to think about the inanimate creation as being morally good, right? But tov, meaning that it has value, right? It is good to God. It has some type of, some may say intrinsic value, others would say it is kind of an imposed value because God created it and God says that it is tov, or good, right? So when you think about that Genesis account, Genesis chapter 1, right? If all of creation is tov, or good, or has value, then there's something inherent about material reality that in the eyes of God is a theology of creation that is good, right? The material world is good. There are some interesting things that flow from a theology of creation as we kind of wrestle with this. And this is all just kind of framework of some places where I want to go a little bit later on. One primary implication is going to be this idea of dependence, right? All of creation is dependent upon God. Now, that's something that we know, we think is a truism, doesn't even need to be said. Well, maybe, right? Because it has some very powerful implications, right? All of creation is dependent upon God, okay? Especially human beings, as human beings find themselves within God's creation, also all of God's world is dependent upon God. The second thing that flows from this as we continue to trace out the biblical narrative is this notion of interdependence. Not only is all creation dependent upon God, but creation is also interdependent on the various parts within the larger biosphere, right? Interdependence. Human beings as biological creatures, right, need the environment to be a particular kind of way in order to thrive and survive, right? Plants, animals, in terms of ecosystems and so on and so forth, all of this becomes important. There's a deep interdependence with respect to creation. Human beings have to rely on each other, right? We are interdependent. No person is an island, right? Even as much as we want to emphasize our autonomy and our freedom, we need other people, right, to support structures and ways of doing life together so that we can exercise autonomy, if that's what we're thinking about, or our freedoms and so on and so forth. There's a deep interdependency that flows from a theology of creation, which means then that when we ask questions about, environmental ethics, right, or the way that some people think about environmental racism, right, which, yes, is a thing, right, in terms of how companies have interacted with particular communities, minority communities and so on and so forth, and what was kind of driving the way that they were doing things that had a detrimental effect and impact on communities of color with respect to the environment. There's a deep interdependency here. So questions of environmental ethics, right, becomes extremely important. It's not something that just, people who are, politically left or whatever care about and talk about. It's a deeply theological issue, and it has a deep impact on actual communities and worse on some communities as opposed to others. And another issue here is this notion of finitude, right? So not only is all creation dependent upon God, and it's interdependent upon the various parts, but also this idea of finitude, right? Limitations, right? There are limits inherent in the creation, right? That becomes important. You think about movements like transhumanism, where people are trying to use technology to go beyond the limitations, right, that are perceived to be detrimental to one's, flourishing and well-being, to try to transcend human limitations, because being human is the problem. We need to strive to be something better, something more than human, right? But a theology of creation reminds us that we are finite. The questions that we ask about end-of-life care, right? Do we continue to use a lot of aggressive life-sustaining treatment long beyond the point where it can help us recover some type or minimal portion of health or so on and so forth? What does this idea of finitude that comes from a theology of creation, how does that inform those decisions? So Eric Moore yesterday, he talked about that. Pastors and church communities engaging in theological reflection, right? So from a theology of creation, this idea of finitude, how does that inform the decisions and choices that we make at the end of life, say, right? That we're limited. What does that say about what type of economic policies we choose, we think about, right? There is no such thing as infinite growth, right? I mean, the issue is that a theology of creation says that all the rest of creation, apart from God, is finite, okay? So those are three implications that flow from this whole idea of theology of creation: dependence, interdependence, and finitude, emphasizing this aspect of the material resources that God has given to us is tov, right, is good. Again, which means that the material reality of the world is a good part of God's creation. And we know that all this has been thwarted by sin, of course, right? But I think it's imperative that we don't start our reflections, especially when we begin to think about social ethics and these kinds of things, with Genesis 3, right? I think we have to start with Genesis 1, right, to get some of these issues right. Let me just take a few minutes here, and again, you can stop and kind of ask me questions along the way as we're trying to hit some of the major points in this outline here. What I also want to do is, as we're kind of camped out on this idea of Genesis 1, of theology of creation, all that comes along with that, this idea of Genesis 1:26-28, right? That's often where we go. We look at 1:26-28. If we were reading this in the Hebrew, there's this rhythm that's developing. We're reading da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Right? Then we'll get to 1:26-28, and it changes a little bit, right? Kind of like this, AABA, kind of pattern in jazz music, right? So you hit this kind of bridge, but this 1:26-28 kind of keys us in on this idea of human beings being created in the image of God. And so let me just read these verses here. Then God said, let us make humankind in our image and in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Okay? So this notion of image of God, right? That human beings are made in the image of God becomes a very important theme or motif or claim that grounds the dignity, the value, and the worth of human beings within God's economy, right? Within a particular theology of creation. But many biblical scholars have wanted to ask the question, right? What does it mean to be the image of God? Right? What does that mean? There have been a lot of things that have been suggested throughout the history of theological thought and biblical interpretation on these issues. I am attracted to thinking about this in a way that people like John Kilner and Ian McFarland and many others have kind of developed by not starting necessarily with Genesis chapter 1:26, but actually starting with Jesus, right? In other words, letting Jesus become the hermeneutical key, if you will, to understanding this issue. And the reason why this becomes important, I think, is for several different reasons, which I hope will become clear a little bit later. But when we think about the New Testament language, right, when we're trying to figure out what does it mean to say that human beings are made according to the image of God, made according to the image of God. When you look at 1:26-28, man is made according to the image or in the image. When you look at the New Testament language, what do you see in Colossians 1:15? Jesus, who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, right? 2 Corinthians 4:14, right? What does that read? It says that Jesus, the image of God, right? That language. So the biblical language refers to the image as being Jesus, right? And so then the question becomes, how do we best understand what it means for all other human beings to be made according to the image of Jesus? Well, some want to say that Jesus becomes the interpretive framework for understanding humanity, right? So instead of us trying to figure out, well, can Jesus be fully human and fully divine? We start looking at characteristics of what our human life is like and say, well, if Jesus is fully divine, he can't be fully human, right? After all, look at how much of a mess humanity is. Well, as many theologians have pointed out, this is to put the cart before the horse in many ways, right? That Jesus becomes the paradigm, if you will, of understanding what it truly means to be human, right? And not a distorted picture of how we do life together and the vision of humanity. So this whole idea of Jesus being the image of God and all other human beings being made according to the image of God matters. Why? Because how do we see God? Because we can see Jesus, the incarnated Jesus. John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John 1:14 says, and the Word was made what? Flesh, and dwelt among us, right? The embodied Jesus, right? So if all creation is good, right, it's material reality, the fact that Jesus decided, or the Word decided to come in human form, embodied in the incarnation, right, that our bodies, right, are good. The incarnation demands that we say that our bodies, our physical bodies are good. The mere fact that the new heavens and new earth will be a material reality demands that this physical world is good, right? Which means then, for us to understand the power of the gospel and the important role of social ethics, we have to take these realities into strong consideration. What this also means is that the particularities of our lives matter, right? Not just the universal aspects of our humanity, so whenever we try to abstract from human beings, right? But the concrete lived experiences of human beings and people's bodies matter. Jesus came as a male at a particular time, at a particular place, a particular political context, a particular religious scene, right? The particularities of our lives matter, okay? So we have to be very careful that we just don't abstract our humanity only, right? We talk about the universal aspects of humanity without taking seriously the concrete, particular lived experiences of our humanity. And Paul talks about this also in was the 1 Corinthians 7, I believe. One of my former colleagues used to talk about this quite a bit. So if I want to suggest that the particularities of our lived experiences matter for understanding not only what it means to be humans, but to flourish in particular ways that God intends, we have to think about this, I think, biblically as well, that Jesus encountered and redeemed people in their particularities, okay? Not only does it seem as if the claim is grounded theologically in the incarnation of Jesus, but also exegetically, okay, or in the biblical teaching. There's a growing body of biblical scholarship dealing with social identities and the gospel that makes these same points. And so I'll just raise one such example that's in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 18, where Paul writes, was the man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? He should not be circumcised. Now, some people commenting on this verse would suggest that Paul here provides two examples for the way he understands previous social identities in relation to God's call. He does this first in relation to Jewish identity when he talks about circumcision, and then to Gentile social identity with regard to uncircumcision. The kind of identity that Paul seeks to create is one that sees previous social identities as maintaining their fundamental significance rather than as something to be set aside as being irrelevant. Many commentators explain that Paul's discourse focuses on his desire to help the Corinthian Christ followers understand that ethnic categories are not obliterated in the gospel, but they are transformed in Christ. Okay? That becomes important because the reality is that as philosopher Thomas Nagel said, that there is no view from nowhere. Right? That all of us are situated historically in particular concrete situations. Right? And so the particularities of our lives, they matter not only for understanding who we are, but then also who we are in Christ. Okay? So when we reflect on this idea of sin entering into the world, think about the fact that, in many traditions we say that sin is pervasive, right? That it affects everything. There's no aspect of creation that has not been touched by sin, right? I'm sure many of you have heard this before, right? Sometimes we focus purely on the relationship between each other and our relationship with God, right? And say, well, sin has impacted all that, and which it has, right, certainly. But sin has affected all of creation, right? Romans 8 talks about that the creation is groaning for the manifestation of the sons of God, right? That nature was impacted by sin. Our personal relationships impacted by sin. Our interpersonal relationships have been impacted by sin. Our social structures have been impacted by sin, right? Remember, societies are more than just a group of people bumping into each other, right? There are ways of doing things, policies and practices and values that are embedded in these social relationships. And if sin is as all-pervasive, theologically, as we think the biblical narrative warns for us, then all of God's good creation has been impacted by sin. Which means then that the gospel in Jesus, as God is redeeming the world, he is redeeming all of creation. Yes, he is redeeming our individual lives so that we can have this personal relationship with him. He's redeeming relationships. Perhaps God is redeeming the social ways we think about how we do life together. God is redeeming the very created order itself. And so when we think about a theology of creation and we highlight the power of the gospel being cosmic in its scope, right, it is highlighting the bigness of God, I want to suggest, right? And so this idea of sin coming into the world is something that challenges us in so many different ways, because it leads us to seriously consider this idea of the social dimensions of sin. I was doing a survey of many textbooks in theology, and very few systematic theologies actually give detailed attention to the social dimensions of sin. Very few. The social dimensions of sin. Sin is usually discussed and categorized in personal and kind of or intrapersonal ways only, right? Maybe talking a little bit about interpersonal, but not as much dealing with the larger social dimensions, how sin expresses itself, which is odd, right? Especially when we think about how pervasive sin is in God's creation, how it has affected so much. And it is also fascinating when you think about the history of our country, right? And the role that American Christian religion has played in that, and thinking about the race relations in this world, and the fact that most of our systematic theologies have not given attention to the social dimensions of sin, especially as it's been expressed in the ways we relate to each other in terms of across racial lines and the formation of the racialized imagination, and the inherent problems with this issue, but I'll come back to that in just a moment here. But I want to, let me just see before I stop and just take a couple questions here. Yeah, let me say one other thing here about this whole idea of sin kind of coming in, permeating all of creation, and we look at this kind of larger picture here. And oftentimes I think we have some misconceptions about the notion of social sin, and I think we also have to be very careful with how we think and talk about these various categories. So let me just find one place here. Sorry, so that's what happens when you go off the script here, right? You're trying to jump ahead a little bit here. Yeah, okay, well, I'll come back to it. So this idea, when you think about sin, I mean, so if sin is as all pervasive as we think, we have to think about it in some creative ways, right? So if sin is pervasive, right, then we also have to stop and ask ourselves something like this. Has sin affected our ability to judge sin? Have we stopped to consider the sinfulness of our sin talk, right? How we even talk about sin at times, right, might be impacted by this whole notion of sin as well. You know, Justo Gonzalez, you know, has a number of sections in some of his work, and I think he does this in a very informative and insightful way. You know, he wants to emphasize the fact that we must distinguish sin from crime, right? And we think about the way we do life together, these social dimensions of sin, and thinking about sin being distinguished from crime. Let me just share with you a couple quotes from Gonzalez on this score. He writes, "Our society, like every society, seeks to bolster its laws and its power structure by giving them religious sanction. Therefore, there is a strong vested interest that seeks to convince us that when we break the law, we commit not only a crime against the state, but also a sin against God. The Almighty God is turned into an ally of the mighty in our society, thus creating an almost invincible alliance. But sin is not always," he notes, note the qualification, "always crime, and crime is not always sin," okay? And so many others have provided counterexamples of ways of thinking about this relationship. They would say, look, if you look at Christians in the early church who refused to obey the law to worship the emperor and were subsequently killed, it was not a sin, though it was considered a crime. It was considered an expression of Christian faithfulness. Moses broke the law of Egypt, and from the standpoint of the Egyptian law, was considered a criminal, right? Early Christians having a common table at which master and slave ate together were breaking the law of Rome. Martin Luther King Jr., some would suggest, broke the laws of many states on the basis of his deep and profound Christian conviction and commitment to the gospel. It's called to love the neighbor, yet many, myself included, thinks that what he was doing there was righteous. All of these folks could legitimately be called criminals, for they indeed broke the laws of the land. We may say these were unjust laws, but they were laws nevertheless. And so many of these individuals were outlaws for God. Some have made such an audacious claim, right, to suggest that the supreme example of this may have been Jesus, right? Gonzalez writes, in this they followed the same path as that convicted outlaw and executed criminal, Jesus of Nazareth. We like to say that his trial was unfair, but the truth is that from the point of view of Roman law and order, anyone who claimed to be the Messiah of Israel was an outlaw, and as such he was tried, convicted, and executed. Those who convicted him and those who executed him had the legal authority to do so. He died as a criminal because he was a criminal, even though we may now declare that the laws that declared him to be such were unjust. So the summary point of all this is that is that we must not confuse crime with sin. Society values law and order above everything else, mostly because those who set such values are the same people who at times are profiting from the present order and from the laws that uphold it. This is true not only of our society, but of any human society. This side of sin, Gonzalez writes, where dominance oftentimes prevails over love, right? Now again, he's not criticizing all of the laws of the land in any way, but it's just this association that we too quickly want to make of crime with sin misses the fact of what King talks about in his letter from Birmingham City Jail, that there is a higher law often that we need to achieve, and how we even understand and think about sin is impacted by sin itself when it becomes expressed in these kind of larger social dimensions. As some say that social sin is kind of like the mundane, right? It's kind of everywhere, and so therefore it's nowhere, right? Because it has permeated everything and it's everywhere, we have a tendency not to see it as much, right? The Bible gives us categories for this. Principalities and powers, right? This is exactly what this notion, I think, that the Apostle Paul raises in the New Testament, which sounds a bit strange to many of us today, but I think this is the idea that's behind the notion of principalities and powers theologically. Stephen Ray says principalities are the systems of thought, interpretation, and material relations that work to impose the dominion of power upon human reality. Okay? An evangelical theologian by the name of Miller Erickson says something somewhat similar here. He says, though there was a concurrent Jewish conception of powers which tended to equate them with personal angelic beings, Paul's usage seems to be a bit more impersonal. He uses the term stoicheia, which means basic principles in Colossians chapter 2. He doesn't quite identify these with angels, right? Paul does seem to be making the point that the powers are fundamental elements of world operation. They are the things which very often control how things go. It is important to realize that the powers were not a manifestation of Satan or some such thing, but were originally created good by Christ, according to Colossians 1:16. Now, stoicheia is a class of the powers that has a special relationship to the law. Directly translated this notion of elements. And so the New Testament states that they function as these kind of custodians of the law. And as the law permeates the structure of the customs and institutions of society, so do powers, and with them, so does evil, right? So Paul reminds us in Ephesians chapter 6, right? We struggle not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms, right? So we have this language, right? And the importance of the spiritual resource that we have to deal with those principalities and powers, but we should never lose sight of the fact that the principalities and powers are operating in the real material world, and it has real consequences on people's lives.